Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. New Zealand is a country that has hit the headlines in recent times for its unique and highly successful approach to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Ireland and New Zealand experience similar climatic conditions, and as a consequence, there are a lot of similarities between the farming systems operated in both countries and also the challenges faced in each country. So how is the farming community in New Zealand responding to the challenges presented by climate change, and what, if any, are the key differences in the New Zealand approach? To discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined live from New Zealand by Dr Sinead Leahy, who is Acting Deputy Director and Senior Science Advisor with the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. Sinead, you're very welcome to the Signpost webinar.
Thanks, Mark. It's really good to be able to join you from the other side of the world. So fantastic to be here.
Great. We're also joined by Pat Murphy, who's our Head of Knowledge Transfer Programme on Environment. Pat, good morning to you.
Good morning all.
So Sinead, you've been based in New Zealand for a number of years now. How you're working in the Greenhouse Gas Research Centre over there. Could you tell us a bit about the work that you're doing over there?
Yeah, hi. So the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, we're predominantly a funder of research in the area of agricultural greenhouse gases. So as we talked about earlier, Mark, my job goes from science advice right through to project management to delivery of services. So it's quite to policy implications as well. So it's quite a wide variety of activities I currently do at the moment. But my background is really around mitigation of methane from ruminant livestock. So that's my real interest.
You did your studies in UCC, is that right?
That's right. I started off actually in UCC, and then, like many people in 2006, went for a short postdoc to New Zealand with the original plan to stay for 2 years. And suddenly it's now 2021 and I'm still here.
Very good. And tell us, Sinead, I know a lot of people are wondering what life is like in New Zealand at the moment due to the COVID pandemic. Compared to Europe and the rest of the world, New Zealand has taken quite a different approach.
Yeah, we like a lot of people are always laugh at me and say, take that smug look off your face. But, we have been really, really, really lucky, and thankfully that's just the quick actions of the New Zealand government. But equally, of course, we're very fortunate in our geographical location. We are far away from the epicenters of the pandemics, and we have the ability to lock down our borders, which meant that we really only had that one serious lockdown way back in sort of March, April last year. And since then, we've been able to really live as normal within our borders. Obviously, international travel has changed the way we've had to work, but we continue to go to concerts, continue to go out for lunch as we always do. So yeah, we're really, really lucky, and it's hard to imagine, how the rest of the world have had to continue in these lockdowns for such a long period. I don't envy. Yeah.
So look, I think without further ado, I think we'll probably get into the presentation, Sinead, because you have lots to share with us. And so I'll ask you to share your screen with us. And just to remind everybody that if you have a question for Sinead, please do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit questions at any stage throughout the presentation. And based on, let's say, the number of questions coming through afterwards, Sinead has agreed to stay on a little bit extra if there are extra questions coming through. So Sinead, with that, we'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So good morning, everybody. If you've ever heard me talk, I always like to start my talk off with this piece of modelling work that was done for the Royal Society of New Zealand's report back in 2016. I think it's just a really nice piece of modelling work that really makes people think about how climate change might matter for New Zealand going forward. So the Earth's temperature is warming, and the level of that warming will really depend on how much greenhouse gases we are going to emit into the atmosphere in the coming decade. New Zealand is no different. It's projected to have some warming. Models suggest it's going to be somewhere between 2.5 and 5 degrees by the end of the century. And if that warming does come to pass, you know, that warming will have some implications around how we might farm the land in New Zealand. This little modeling piece that I'm showing is really, I'm taking a very simple metric. So it's just really, we're looking at number of days exceeding 25 degrees. And you can see here back in 2015, New Zealand looks very green, which is really reflective of that nice temperate climate that we have here in New Zealand, which is really perfect for the type of agriculture that we do and we do well, which is pastoral agriculture. But if you take that business as usual scenario, so that's where we as a global population continue living as we do now, and model it out to 2050, you can see that those temperature increases are starting to slightly change certain parts of New Zealand. So, you know, you can see number of days exceeding 25 degrees in certain parts being, you know, a lot more, which of course is great if you're going on holidays, but not so great if you're trying to grow grass, you know. And here in New Zealand, ryegrass is one of our typical plant species. It likes that temperature range between somewhere between 5 and 18 degrees. Out to 2100, and now you see that things are really starting to change for certain parts of New Zealand, moving away from that temperate climate, heading to a subtropical climate. And this will have implications for how we farm the land in certain regions of New Zealand. Now, obviously, New Zealand, we're a small country. We only emit, you know, 0.02% of the world's gross emissions. But I think it's really important to note that what the world does will have implications for what happens in New Zealand. So what is New Zealand doing about this? What's the size of the mitigation task for New Zealand? New Zealand has committed to the Paris Agreement. So we have two sets of climate targets. We've got our international target, which relates to the Paris Agreement, and then we've also got our domestic targets, which are within our own borders. In terms of our international target, we've agreed to reduce our emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And that will be a hard task for New Zealand to measure or to meet. In terms of our domestic targets, I think we're one of the first countries to sort of take this approach. We've taken a split gas approach, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on, why that has major implications for the agriculture sector in New Zealand. And as part of our domestic targets, we've agreed to reduce our methane by 10% below 2017 levels. So that's biogenic methane, and I'll describe where that comes from in New Zealand later on. And then for our 2050 targets, we've committed to reducing to net emissions. So that means we'll allow offset, for example, by planting of trees, which suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We're going to have net emissions of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide to zero. And again, that nitrous oxide really relates to the agricultural sector, and I'll show that later. And our 2050 target for methane is to reduce it to somewhere in the range of 24 to 47% below 2017 levels. And our Climate Change Commission will at some point around 2035, I think, make some decisions about what that actual target will be. And that will be very much dependent on whether there are technologies available. Often a question that I get asked in New Zealand is, are we the only ones doing this? And of course, we're not. When you sort of match us up against some of our major competitors in the agricultural sector, you see that many of them have very similar Paris Agreement commitments to us, if not more. Another thing that I like to point out is, New Zealand, we are an export nation. We export, around 90% of the food that we produce. And so we're very reliant on international markets. And we supply a lot of major companies with our produce. One of the things to keep in mind that some of these major companies are putting in place some very ambitious climate targets for their companies, particularly around, for instance, Scope 3 emissions, which often relate to on-farm emissions. And as such, while governments might be putting in place targets, etc., New Zealand does have to keep an eye on what the markets are doing, because companies may outflank governments and actually be a much more bigger driver of change than perhaps governments. So just something to keep in mind. So what are New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions? So New Zealand is really unique among developed countries in that almost half of its emissions come from the agricultural sector. If you compare this to the sort of average developed country emissions profile, where agriculture really only commits somewhere between 11 and 14%. I think Ireland is probably one of the closest to New Zealand, and I'm sure there's somebody who can correct me, but I'm sure it's around 30 to 33%. Where agriculture contributes to its country profile. As a result, while many countries will be focusing on the sort of CO2 side of their emissions profile, New Zealand is in this unique scenario where it has much diverse proportion of greenhouse gases in terms of methane and nitrous oxide, which are the big agricultural gases, make up a large proportion of our gas profile. And that means if we're going to try and make those targets, then we really have to look at our agricultural sector. Because just another point to make, a lot of countries will be working on their energy sector, but New Zealand's very fortunate in that a large proportion of its energy already comes from renewable resources. So when I talk about agricultural greenhouse gases, I'm really talking about methane and nitrous oxide. There is, of course, carbon dioxide that comes from driving your tractor or drying of our milk powder, but that gets accounted for in other sectors. It's a little bit of carbon dioxide that comes from our application of lime, but predominantly when you're talking about agriculture greenhouse gases, you're really talking about methane and you're really talking about nitrous oxide. And the big source really of methane is from enteric fermentation. And the big source of nitrous oxide is really from those urine patches from ruminant livestock, again, in New Zealand. So when I talk about enteric methane, what am I talking about? It's really, the cow eats the grass goes down into the stomach, the forestomach of the animal. And there you have this microbial population, which break down that plant material into smaller compounds that the animal can use. Some of the byproducts of that digestion can get used by the animal and instead get used by this unique group of microorganisms, which we call methanogens or methane forming microbes. So they take those byproducts of digestion that the animal can't use and they convert it into methane, which then gets burped out or eructated out the front of the animal. About 95% of the methane comes out the front and a little bit comes out the back in terms of where we deal with manure. In terms of nitrous oxide, the animal has nitrogen in its urine. It goes onto the urine patch, and there we have microbial soil processes that go on that take some of that nitrogen in the urine and convert it into nitrous oxide, which gets emitted up into the atmosphere. So they're the sources really of our two main gases. The thing that I'm often asked in New Zealand is, livestock are carbon neutral. Why do we need to worry about it, Sinead? And in a sense, livestock are neither a source nor a sink of carbon dioxide. But the thing when it comes to global warming is they are a source of methane and they are a source of nitrous oxide. In terms of trends in New Zealand agricultural emissions, what's been happening? So we started reporting our emissions around 1990, like many other countries, just a reflection of us joining international agreements. And you can see that since 1990, our greenhouse gas emissions have increased about 17% in the agricultural sector. That's much less than what we've seen, for example, in the transport sector, which has increased by about 35%. In terms of what's happening within our sector, you can see there that the dairy over the last couple of decades has expanded and taken on more of a proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand. And we've seen reductions in our sheep industry. And that really was a reflection of many sheep and beef farmers being converted to dairy over the last few decades. I often put this slide in because I think it just shows how difficult it is actually to predict what will happen with agricultural emissions. And in many cases, even these graphs are often done in conjunction with industry and government. They're often turn out to not come to pass. For example, one of our national communications back in 2013, this was a time in New Zealand, the milk price was really good. There was huge expansion of dairy, and government and industry predicted that we would get a huge increase in emissions from the agricultural sector. But then by 2017, that had become a lot more constrained. We weren't expanding as much as we thought. There was water regulations coming in, and so the government predicted that it would level out. And our latest one, which is down in 2019, really shows that we are predicting a huge drop in our agricultural emissions. But in most cases, when we've put these through, the actual predictions have been incorrect. The slide I put in because we have a lot of discussion, or not so much now, but previously a lot of people used to talk about emissions intensity, which is really, you're talking about the amount of emissions produced per kg of product, lamb, milk solid, whatever. And it was really around, a lot of people say, well, we're reducing our emissions intensity, but that doesn't necessarily mean you actually reduce your absolute emissions or your total concentration of the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And I think that's an important distinction that we had to sort of talk about a lot, because when it comes to the targets, they're all around absolute emissions. When a farmer will be priced for his greenhouse gas emissions, it will be around absolute emissions. It won't be around your emissions intensity. And just an example where, a reduction in emissions intensity doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in absolute emissions is really the story of the dairy sector in New Zealand. So over the last decade, as I've said, few decades, the number of dairy cattle have, pretty much doubled in New Zealand. At the same time, New Zealand farmers have become very efficient at their production of milk, and the amount of milk solids per cow has increased because of the productivity and the on-farm efficiencies our farmers have been making. And as a result, we've seen, large increases in the total amount of milk solids coming from the New Zealand herd. And this has meant that really, the amount of emissions produced per kg of milk solid has actually increased over the last few decades. But because we had such an expansion in the number of animals, dairy animals in New Zealand, what that's meant is that the total emissions from our dairy sector have actually increased. And so that's just one example where, yes, we've reduced our emissions intensity, but we actually increased our absolute emissions. And as I said, the key message that we try to get across with this slide is really that it's absolute emissions that will count when it comes to our targets. Of course, the efficiency gains that New Zealand farmers have made have contributed to a mitigation effect, and we can show that through our recording of our greenhouse gases. So, for instance, if New Zealand farmers had continued to produce just like they did, 20 or 30 years ago, our emissions now could have risen by 40%, but instead they actually increased by 17%. So, and that was done at a time when it was nothing to do with climate change. It really was the practices that were being put in place were really just good practice and made sense at the bottom line. But what it really tells us now is that New Zealand farmers are very efficient, and yes, there are some gains we can continue to make which will help with our mitigation going forward. But really, if we want to make large gains in our large reductions in our agricultural greenhouse gases, particularly to our 2050 targets around that 47%, then we will need new technologies. to be able to do that. There's been, in the last 12 months or so, there's been quite a lot of work around agricultural greenhouse gases and policies. And I thought I'd share this with you today because I thought it might be of interest. So right now in New Zealand, in terms of our policy tool for greenhouse gases, it's really our emissions trading scheme. It was designed back in the late 1990s. It was designed to be for all gases and all sectors. But due to various different reasons, political and so forth, agriculture was never included. And right now, the only gas that is really priced is carbon dioxide. So if there isn't a price on our agricultural greenhouse gases, how is the agricultural sector in New Zealand planning to meet its targets? And as I said, there are specific targets to the agricultural sector in New Zealand, particularly around methane and nitrous oxide. So the conversation around this really began to accelerate back in April 2019 when our interim climate change committee, put out their first document, which really recommended putting a price on agricultural greenhouse gases. In that report, the Commission basically listed a variety of different ways that agricultural emissions could be priced from, being priced at the processor level, to a levy and rebate scheme, to per hectare, to a voluntary approach, etc. There was a number of tools put forward. At the same time, industry came together, the agricultural sector came together, and they put forth a proposal to the government to say that they would take responsibility and that they would decide on a farm level system for pricing greenhouse gas emissions. That went out to consultation to the New Zealand government, and the government agreed. And so what we have now is what we call a He Waka Eka Noa, which is Maori for we're all in this together. And it's essentially a primary sector climate action partnership. And milestones from that partnership have been put into legislation through the ETS reforms, which were done back in June 2020. So the sort of main features of that agreement is that agricultural greenhouse gases will be priced from 2025. So it's a real clear signal to the sector now. They're going to be farm level for livestock, and they will be at processor level for fertilizer. Some of the key dates are really around December 2022, where the Minister for Climate Change and Agriculture will need to put forward the details of the pricing scheme that will be developed by He Waka Eka Noa. And also just the Commission will also review the milestones that are set in legislation. And just for interest, these are some of the milestones that the sector are going to have to meet. By December 2022, 100% of all farmers and growers will need to know their annual total on-farm GHGs. And then, by December 2024, 100% of farmers and growers will have a written plan to measure and manage emissions. And I always have a little giggle here because the day later, it's the 1st of January 2025, they'll have all farms in New Zealand will use a system for farm level accounting and reporting of the 2024 agricultural greenhouse gases at the farm level. So, that's a real challenge for the industry to get all of that together.
And Sinead, could I ask how is it envisaged that those measurements would be taken at a farm level, or that accountancy would be brought down to a farm level?
Yeah, I think there's still uncertainty around that actually, Mark. He Waka Eka Noa are currently, going together, and I'll show you now in a moment what their key milestones will be. But it's not clear at the moment what that's going to be. So that's the job really of He Waka Eka Noa to put that together. So what happens if the milestones aren't met? So when the government agreed this partnership, they put a little sting in the tail because they said, if the Climate Change Commission comes in and, He Waka Eka Noa hasn't made progress according to those milestones, then the government can bring agriculture into the ETS at the processor level before 2025. And again, if Hawaka Ekanoa have not come up with that farm level pricing mechanism by 2025, again, agriculture will come into the ETS at the processor level. And the reason the industry really are arguing for having it at the farm level, because they want to have farmers have control and get rewarded for the actions that they do. Whereas if it goes in at the processor level, they won't even see it. So Hawaka Ekanoa has 5 work streams, and Mark, the 2 big ones there are, 2 and 4, is their emissions reporting. So they're going to have to develop the criteria, the methodologies and definitions for a farm level accounting system. And then they're also going to have to devise up a farm level pricing mechanism to incentivize farmers and growers to reduce their eggs and contribute to the 2050 targets. So that's still really unclear and ongoing at the moment. But what we do now have is a very clear signal from our government that, agricultural greenhouse gases will be priced at the farm level from 2025. More recently, so this report from our climate change, its first draft advice, had come out on Sunday this week. It's a massive document, so everybody's currently digesting it this week. But essentially, what this Climate Change Commission report has put forward is essentially a proposed path for how New Zealand can meet its targets, its domestic targets. And it's not just agriculture, it's focusing across all society. So from energy to transport to waste, etc. This is currently out for formal consultation to the New Zealand public to decide if this is the pathway that New Zealand would like to take. Consultation closes at the end of May, and then after that, the government will have an opportunity to either accept or not accept the Climate Change Commission's recommendations and put something into a legislation, I think, by the end of this year. So this is a very important document for New Zealand people. I had a quick run through the large document, and I thought I'd pick out a couple of key points from the report on the proposed pathway for New Zealand and how it relates to agriculture. So as I said, our 2050 target, we've got a methane target of 2030, and we've got a 2050 target for both methane and nitrous oxide. So the report really assumes that we'll have no new technologies in agriculture to help us reduce methane before 2035. The path proposes that we would see dairy and sheep and beef animal numbers each reduced by around 15% from 2018 levels by 2030. That that particular point has really seen a lot of interest in the media, people reporting, the Commission has said, we want 15%, but that actually compares, with an 8 to 10% reduction that's models under current policies. So it's not that further down the track than what's expected to happen under a business as usual scenario. The Commission has suggested that we'll need to adopt low emission practices on farm, but continue our historic efficiency gains, which means that we'll see no reduction in the amount of product produced by New Zealand agriculture. It's recommended that we see selective breeding for lower emissions sheep progressively adopted, which is a known technology now. And there's obviously land use changes. It's suggesting that there'll be a change from some of our dairy land into horticulture of about 2,000 hectares per year from 2025. Pine trees will play an important role in getting to 2050, but we've got to acknowledge that that's only a short-term option unless you're leaving it there for longer periods and not carbon farming. So it's about average of 25 hectares per year up to 2030. And also they've recommended that we see an increase in new native forests on less productive lands. And they're saying that we move from about 12,000 hectares in 2021, increase to about 25,000 hectares per year by 2030. So they're sort of some of the key points that the Commission have put forth for the agricultural sector to meet our targets. So by the mid of this year, we'll have a clear idea of what the path that New Zealand has decided to take. So just a little bit on mitigating emissions. How am I going for time, Mark?
You've about 10 minutes left,
Oh,
Sinead.
okay, perfect. Yeah, brilliant. So this is a big one that I often get asked quite a lot when I'm out on farm here in New Zealand. You know, a lot of farmers now starting to get their head around agricultural greenhouse gases and what that might mean for the business and what they need to be thinking about now. Well, right now, of course, we know there's a clear signal that there will be emissions priced at the farm level at 2025. But the first step in mitigation is really finding out your on-farm greenhouse gas emissions. You know, you can't manage what you don't know. And that's always the first step that I recommend to anyone who's interested in starting to think about potential mitigation options for their business. When I talk about mitigation options for New Zealand agriculture, I tend to group them into sort of three groups. The first one is really around that further increase in animal productivity and farm efficiency. So, you know, on-farm sort of system change, you know, tweaks of your farm system. The second area is really around additional technologies that directly reduce emissions. And this is where I work. The New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Centre has played an important role. We're really a funder of a lot of science that's going to support the development of technologies that can directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then the third one I sort of lump in together, it's really around policy actions and land use change. In New Zealand, a lot of the farming community are really concerned with the water regulations and what that might mean for their business, which will really constrain, you know, in certain areas of New Zealand, total production, or actually mean that some parts of New Zealand may not be able to farm the way they do now. We also are seeing quite a lot of selling of our sheep and beef farming to carbon farming, so moving over to forestry. And of course, forestry would typically be considered a lower emitting land use. Equally, we're also seeing a lot of farmers think about diversifying their business, putting a small part of their business into things like cropping and horticulture. And of course, those types of activities tend to have a lower emissions profile per hectare than, for example, livestock farming. So I won't spend too long here because I know you recently had a presentation by Sinead Waters, who sort of talked a lot about on-farm sort of system change, but just at the high level, really, you know, in New Zealand, there's been quite a lot of modelling studies and expert judgments that really suggest that if New Zealand farmers all became as efficient as they could be in relation to greenhouse gas mitigations, we'd see somewhere between a 2 and 10% reduction at the national level in our agricultural greenhouse gases. But I think it's important to note that this way is quite complex, because, you know, each farm will have a unique emissions profile, and really there's no one size all that solution that fits each farm, because it all really depends on the system that you're operating, the skill of the staff that you have, you know, the climate and the soil conditions that you're working in, and what might work for Jane down the road may not work for John right beside her. And so we really sort of point out that, you know, each farm is different, and you really have to really sort of monitor what you're doing in terms of farm manager to find out really what mitigations might actually work for you when it comes to on-farm practice. Number of things that have been sort of modeled and are looked at in New Zealand. One of the big ones, of course, is around increasing individual animal performance while reducing stocking rate, but you've always got to be careful there if you're managing down your stock, you know, around low emissions of feeds, less intensive systems, once a day milking versus twice a day milking, you know, reduction in fertilizer use. We already talked about diversifying your farm system, and then how you manage your manure. So a lot of different ways, but as I said, each farm is different, and all of those sort of practices come with a caveat that they may not work. They may or may not work on your farm, in your system. I often get asked, Sinead, can you really give us something, you know, like sum it up? I can't give you a generic solution, but can you give me something to sort of think out? And the sort of generic statements that I would say to anyone is really, methane emissions are related to the total amount of dry matter eaten. And there's been a lot of work done by New Zealand scientists that for a New Zealand forage-fed animal, the back of the envelope calculation is really around 21 grams of methane is produced per kg of feed eaten. And so dry matter intake is really the key parameter there. In terms of nitrous oxide emissions, it sort of depends really on the total amount of nitrogen that's flowing through your system, either through your feed or your fertilizer. You play with that amount and you'll see some impact on your greenhouse gas farm profile. When it comes to new technologies, sorry, I forgot my Barry's tea here. There's a number of areas of research that New Zealand has concentrated on. Already talked to you about mentioned low methane emitting sheep. In New Zealand researchers some time back, measured quite a lot of animals and found that there were some high naturally and some low. They've gone on to do a lot more research, and they found that, and taken traditional animal breeding approaches, and found that between the very highs and the very lows, it's about at 20% different, about 10% on average. They've gone on even further and found why that difference is in terms of a low emissions phenotype. We know that the rumen size is smaller on a low emissions animal. Its flow rate is different, and its microbial community function slightly differently. They've looked at productivity, and there's no adverse effects seen. And so scientists are now working with industry to roll that out into the National Sheep Index, and it's now currently available to a select number of breeders for them to incorporate into their genetics. And in the next 1 to 2 years, it'll be available to all farmers if they would like to choose the low emissions phenotype and incorporate it into their genetics. So it will be available, but will it be taken up? That's yet to be seen. Work started on low emitting cattle. The researchers feel that what they've learned in sheep should transfer to cattle, and so work is started on with the dairy companies in working with and the dairy cattle. There's a little bit of work on New Zealand on low N excreting cattle. There's not much work in terms of science showing if they actually contribute to a reduction in nitrous oxide emission, but in theory, if you've got low N excreting cattle, then you'll have less nitrogen in the urine, less nitrogen available to be converted into nitrous oxide emissions. The big ones for New Zealand, if we really want to be hitting, that 47% methane emissions by 2050, is the methane vaccine. It's one of these ones that's been researched for quite some time now with no success, but there's a real interest by the farming community to get this one to work. It's just so attractive from the fact that it's would be incredibly low cost. It's very acceptable to on-farm management, very acceptable to consumers. Quite practical in terms of you probably just vaccinate your animal once when it's born, and perhaps a booster later on. And in theory, if it was to work, it's predicted that it would see somewhere between a 20% to 30% reduction in methane emissions per animal. So where researchers have got to in that is that they can make it work in the lab. They can make it work in bottles that replicate an actual animal, but when they go out into a real animal, it doesn't work. And so where they're at now is trying to identify, what are the barriers to it not working or what are the reasons that it's not working in an actual animal. There's been quite a comprehensive review of the program more recently by experts from outside the field. And essentially their recommendation was that there's no reason that it can't work. The scientists have found no reason why it won't work. And so work will continue into that technology because it's just so attractive to New Zealand, but also to the global community. You've probably heard from Sinead around methane inhibitors. There's obviously a good one coming out in the market, 3-NOP. And there's also a lot of work done on other inhibitors as well, but probably 3-NOP or Bovar is likely to be the first cab off the rank when it comes to that type of technology. In terms of nitrification inhibitors, there's quite a nice story. Well, it's not a good story, but it's a nice story around nitrification inhibitors in New Zealand, because we actually had a very good one. It's DCD. It was applied on pasture. Could reduce nitrous oxide emissions from urine patches somewhere around 50%. But back in around 2011, 2013, their DCD was found in residues of milk. Now, DCD is perfectly safe. It's about as safe as table salt, but it was so safe, nobody ever thought to do the regulatory things that you need to do when it comes to something like this. And as the technology got better for identifying residues in milk, suddenly they came across DCD. They looked across at the Codex Alimentaris, or the minimum accepted level, and they found that it was 0. And of course, that essentially meant that it wasn't allowed in milk. But it was along the same time in China. This was around the time when there was a melamine scare, which, we had newborn babies dying in China. And if there's any chemical people out there, they'll know that DCD is very structurally similar to melamine. And so pretty much that was a huge concern for the Chinese market, and nearly cost New Zealand the Chinese market. But that DCD was taken off the market, and none of the dairy companies in New Zealand would want to use it. Currently, it was never a safety issue. It was just a market perception issue. But there's a lot of research going into newer nitrification inhibitors. And there's a lot of work going on around low emissions feed. But of course, New Zealand is a typical ryegrass clover diet. So there's not much at the national level ability
Sinead,
to get
we're
reductions
coming close to our time now.
I'm last
just
slide.
allow for questions. I know there's lots of questions coming in here. So
okay, cool. So this is my last slide, everybody. Sorry. So just to sum up, really, what are New Zealand farmers needing to be thinking about now? So this is really specific to New Zealand, but it might, it probably maybe replicates in Ireland. I'm sure you'll tell me. But essentially, when farmers talk to me, I really talk about, I think the first thing they really need to do now, because of those clear signals, is know their current farm GHG emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, so they can benchmark against what's happening in the sector. I think they really need to be aware of where the sources and sinks of their greenhouse gases are on their business, so that they can basically think about the mitigation strategies that they might want to use, or the land use changes, and obviously start to get an idea of what that implications are for their business profitability. We always say forestry is such a complicated area, particularly when you're talking about offset, and a lot of people don't really understand forestries and offset and what it might mean for your business. A lot of people think they can just plant and they'll all be good. That's not the case when you're looking for some off case, unless it's unless you're planting permanent forest. The key one here, I think, is being aware of what's happening in the wider sector. A lot of farmers say, Sinead, how, am I meant to reduce my emissions by 10% below 2017 level? And I'm like, no, that is an actual national climate target. It's not an on-farm target that you have to meet. And as I said, there's a lot of sheep and beef farm going into forestry. There's some dairy conversions, water restrictions are taking some dairy, which all remove livestock farming, which means that the more that's sort of done at the sector level might mean that the less you have to do at the on-farm level. So it's important that you keep aware of what's happening in the wider sector. And then there's just one there around water regulations, which is really specific to New Zealand. But it's all around now, I think, just getting prepared for what's coming. There's no urgency, but it's just about being prepared and being prepared to act quickly if needed. If you're interested in more information, I'll direct you to the Ag Matters website in New Zealand. It talks a little bit about, there's a shot from the website. Yeah, I'm at the NZA GRC, always happy to answer questions. And that's me, Mark. So hopefully I haven't gone too over time.
Oh, thank you, Sinead. No, I think it was important to allow that little extra time there, just to, I know we have a huge amount of viewers here today that are really interested in what's going on in New Zealand, given the similarities between the countries.
Yeah.
You talked about pricing. How in practice do you see that operating at a farm level, or is it still in discussion?
It's still very much in discussion, and we haven't seen. I'm not involved in those farm reporting and farm pricing milestones from He Waka Eke Noa, but I would hope to think that by the end of this year or early next year, that we'll start to get some indication from He Waka Eke Noa about what they might look to as a pricing mechanism, but it's still really unsure. As I said, the Climate Change Commission, the interim report, put forward a number of suggestions, but we're not clear on what how that pricing mechanism will work. Yeah.
You showed in one of your slides the ambition there to reduce animal numbers whilst maintaining production or output.
Yeah.
Is that, am I right? And is that seen as the sort of the ceiling?
Yeah. Well, that's a model path that's out for recommendation. So the New Zealand country as a country will have to decide if that's acceptable. But yeah, it's really around one of the key things for on-farm practice is really around can farmers reduce their numbers but increase productivity per animal, and through that you can maintain production, but you'll also get some slight decreases in emissions. Now, there's always the complex thing, we always talk about, so if someone says, oh, I'll reduce my cows, that's great. But now I've got all of this excess feed available. What will I do with that? Well, I'll feed it to my animals, and sometimes it ends up actually not being as much a reduction as you want. So there are some complexities around reducing your stocking number and how that actually works on farm in relation to GHGs, and that sort of goes to my point there that I talked about. That farm system changes, even at the minor levels, you've got to be monitoring what you're doing before you actually go, this is what I'm going to do for GHG emissions. Yeah, but that's what they've suggested. Yeah. Just
thank you, Sinead. Just remind everybody, today's webinar is being recorded and Sinead's presentation will be available on the website afterwards. Pat, lots and lots of really good questions coming in there.
Huge number of questions, but a significant number of questions on the complementarity or otherwise of greenhouse gas and water quality policy in New Zealand, and how the two of those are going to work together.
Yeah, that's a big one. So, right now, it's almost like greenhouse gases are outpacing the water regulations and so forth. So, people are still struggling with how we're going to, monitor and look after our water regulations, and, GHGs has sort of jumped. So I don't think there's an answer to that question, only that, yep, absolutely, they need to be thought as together. There's discussions with He Waka Eke Noa around farm environmental plans. Now, I don't know if Ireland has such a thing, but it's about, there's conversations going on around, there being one farm environmental plan that really incorporates all of the environmental issues, related to on farm. But I don't think we have an actual real answer, only that, yes, we know they're linked, they need to be linked. How we're going to link them, is still under discussion. But certainly, I think, greenhouse gases seems to be jumping ahead of water, when really we need to be doing water and bringing them all alongside together. So, yeah, awareness, but no answers on that one. Sorry to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I suppose a question in relation to, say, a move to horticulture that you mentioned. I suppose one of the issues here in Ireland relating to a move to tillage or horticulture is the amount of carbon in the soil and potential release of that. Is that a potential issue or a potential consideration?
Right now, so soil carbon is a huge topic in New Zealand. You know, any farmer discussion group I go to, whatever, you know, there will be people who say, I am sequestering carbon, etc. But we really don't have the research in New Zealand around soil carbon and what's actually happening to our soil carbon. We don't account for it currently, you know, bar, you know, large land use change, you know, from forestry to, you know, to grazing, pasture, or etc. We don't, in our national inventory, we don't account for soil carbon. So in a sense, I wouldn't say it's not accounted for yet. We're currently working on getting the information around what's happening to New Zealand's soil carbon under the various different management practices that we do. The limited research that we have around soil carbon is that New Zealand on a whole is neither gaining nor losing soil carbon. And we've just implemented a 12-year study that will monitor around 500 sites around New Zealand across different farming systems and different geographical locations and soils and etc. to try and get a data set to be able to understand our soil carbon. So yes, there's although the Climate Change Commission have recommended that that there will be a change to horticulture, and of course acknowledged that there is loss of soil carbon, you know, during some of those management practices in horticulture, but it's because it's not accounted for currently, we're really just getting the information around that. Yeah.
I have a question in relation to I suppose, the pricing of emissions, but also the counting of emissions in relation to GWP 100 versus GWP star. Is there any conversation going on in relation to that in New Zealand? Yeah,
there has been, but I think because we have, you know, we've split out the gases. So we already acknowledge that, you know, methane is a short-lived gas. And as a result, methane has in a sense, a lighter target than, for instance, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So if you remember, methane does not have to go to zero. And it's measured in, you know, methanes per ton. We're not talking about any CO2 equivalents for domestic targeted methane. It is measured in methane units. And so in a sense for us, GWP star, you know, is not as hot a topic as it would be elsewhere, because we've already acknowledged that yes, methane is different to the long-lived gases such as nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And also, of course, when you look at policy, you know, and that's the thing, you know, there's obviously quite a lot globally, a huge discussion around GWP star, and obviously acknowledge that it does deal with short-lived gases much better than, for example, GWP 100. But, you know, the thing I always say about metrics, you know, there's a lot of them out there. They all have various different pros and cons. They were all designed for scientific purposes. And so, you know, when it comes to policy, you know, the reason GWP 100 was sort of uptaken was just the best of a selection of metrics that was available at the time. And now we're in a position where, for instance, the Paris Agreement, you know, all of that climate targets and etc. have been put in GWP 100 metric. Now, it doesn't stop you from reporting in GWP star, but for instance, if we were to change over to a GWP star, then that entire Paris Agreement and all of the targets and etc. would have to change. So I often say, you know, I'm certainly not an atmospheric scientist, and you know, on sort of boots on the ground sort of thing is like, yeah, GWP star, it's all, you know, it's all a little bit of a jazzy people are going on with it, but you know, right now we've got to move with GWP 100. And you know, New Zealand, we've separated out, we acknowledge there's a difference between methane and those long-lived gases, and that's reflected in our targets. So I think the conversation about GWP star has sort of lulled more recently. Yeah. So.
Here in Ireland, we kind of refer to our issues under a heading of gaseous emissions, which includes ammonia. Is ammonia an issue in New Zealand, or is it considered to be an issue? And are there actions there associated with its mitigation?
No, like we don't really talk about ammonia per se. It's obviously, you know, part of the nitrification cycle and so forth. But we, you know, it's really when we talk about agricultural emissions, we really are just talking about methane and nitrous oxide. Obviously, within the water quality area, it's probably talked about a bit more. But in terms of the agricultural greenhouse gas space, it's really just methane and nitrous oxide.
Okay, another couple of questions, or a good few questions relating to, you talked about ryegrass swards, but is there much emphasis on potential benefits of moving towards clover-based or multi-species swards in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I think New Zealand actually naturally has actually quite a lot of, you know, well, mixed species. I suppose it depends how many in their mixed species, but, you know, yes, there is a conversation around that, and there's a wide variety of different plants. I just mentioned ryegrass because it's just the one that I sort of know, and it's always been the sort of traditional ryegrass clover diet. But there is a mixture. There is particularly around soil carbon. There's a lot of talk around mixed swards, etc. But as I said, when it comes to reduction of greenhouse gases, you know, particularly methane, if you want to use feed to help reduce or, you know, find specific feeds that will reduce methane, you really often have to feed them at quite a high proportion of the diet. And so because New Zealand will stick to what it grows and what it grows well, so, and what it's cheap to grow. So the opportunity to use, you know, sort of different feeds in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases is quite limited in New Zealand. And that's why, you know, there's a lot of focus on other technologies more so than low emissions feeds are changing to a different system.
We have a question here, Sinead, in relation to the 15% reduction that you talked about and what impact that might have on production systems. There's a suggestion here that maybe a reduction in land available for dairy production. And do you think that the industry might move to a more intensive system, high input, high output, to maintain the amount of milk produced?
Yeah, I don't think, when I haven't looked in detail at what the model has been done for that climate change commission report, but in terms of it intensity, I don't know that according to what they've modeled, it, you know, it is going to be around continuing business as usual, but, you know, which has been, you know, we see those increases in efficiency gain. I think it's about 1% per year. So I don't think they're envisioning that there'll be, you know, major changes to what is predicted already. So it's almost like business as usual, but a slight reduction. As I said, those under current policies were predicted to see 8 to 10% reduction. So the Climate Change Commission are just, you know, pushing it out just a little bit further. Yeah.
And in relation to, I mean, there's going to be obviously a huge advisory effort, knowledge transfer in terms of rolling out these various measures and schemes. I mean, how is that being considered, or is there?
Yeah, so you saw there in Hawaka and NOAA, their fifth stream was really around extension, communication, etc. More recently, one of the things we've been doing, our mandate has always been around you know, funding research. But during our last review, we actually got criticized because even though it was never in our mandate, it was like, why weren't we out, you know, sort of communicating the information to the people on the ground? And so, although it was never on our mandate, it has now slightly crept in. So one of the things we are doing on behalf of the New Zealand government and working with industry and et cetera and so forth is working with rural professionals and starting to raise the knowledge in our rural professionals group, because they're often the people who are, first port of call for the farmers to start to have a discussion around agricultural greenhouse gases. And so more recently we've seen, so we've been involved. I think we've reached over 300 rural professionals in New Zealand during the last year, giving these sort of one day, just general 101. First morning is about the science, and then in the second, the afternoon is really working with, we've got a fantastic farm consultant who sort of takes them through how you might model all of your different farm management practices and what that means. If you change X, what happens to Y, and etc. And so that's just starting. And then I think He Waka Ekanoa in their 5th work stream are likely to sort of increase that out. And there's absolutely in that climate change commission report that's come out, they specifically mentioned that support will be needed in order to get our agricultural sector up to date, in order to be able to understand what needs to be done when it comes to our targets, and agriculture.
We're just going past 10:30. So what I'm going to just let our viewers know that we're going to continue on for another 15 minutes with questions. We understand if people have to leave with other commitments, but just to let people know that next week we'll have Patrick Forrestal from Teagasc and Johnson Castle is going to be talking about a research update on protected urea. So if people want to dial in for that next Friday. So we'll continue, and it's interesting you should talk about connecting with rural professionals. That's one of the main objectives of this connected program that's behind me here, is to engage with the professional community and non-farming community that are so important to supporting the agri-food sector. So
the last thing you want is a scientist talking to a farmer. Someone like me.
I'm not sure if I go that far. I think, Sinead, you do a very good job at it.
It's a long time since I milked a cow, so I tend to stay away from that.
That could be sorted.
Yeah.
We can arrange that. We'll continue on with the questions. So, and if that's okay with you, Sinead, we'll
absolutely.
I know it's getting late over in New Zealand. It's coming up to, what is it? You're 13 hours. Is that right?
Yeah, half 11. So it's a wild Friday night for me here in New Zealand. Yeah, it's almost time for wine, maybe.
Oh.
and head out.
We won't stop you doing that.
Yeah.
I think a good few questions about the capping or the potential capping of numbers, and a point being made that the numbers are the independent decisions of 40,000 farmers who are having those. Is there any thought in New Zealand as to how that capping of numbers might be put in place?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're anywhere close to sort of that to that sort of level of detail, and I think, although they've modeled it out, the conversation is that, the way New Zealand is moving, and the way there's quite a lot of our sheep and beef farms are being converted to forestry, and there's a real economic reason for why that's actually happening. Because of the water regulations that are happening, that we'll actually naturally see there's a sort of a natural land use change occurring in New Zealand, just similar to what would have happened decades ago when we had the end of subsidies in New Zealand, and a lot of people thought it would be the end of farming, but it didn't. It continued on and grew in a sec. So there's a feeling that that business as usual scenario. So even though people say that it will actually probably naturally happen, because there'll be so much land, probably, or a certain amount of land taking out of livestock farming, and we'll just see what's left behind. And so you'll see this natural reduction in numbers. And I don't think, I would hope, and I don't particularly envision New Zealand ever capping, particular numbers, but I think it's probably likely to happen. Whether they'll get to 15%, I think that's, who knows, but certainly, the sort of business as usual scenario predicts somewhere between 8 and 10% reduction in numbers, just, happening as is.
A couple of questions coming in relation to Mark mentioned about the talk next week in relation to protected urea, NPT treated urea. What's the story in relation to its use in New Zealand?
That I don't know that much about that, Pat. So I'm not even going to attempt to answer that one. Yeah,
that's fine. Okay. Just, I suppose, a couple of questions there as to the attitude of farmers and maybe changes in attitude over the last while to a number of factors. We have one specific question in relation to attitude to forestry, but I think a couple of general questions in relation to the attitudes of farmers to what's coming down the line in terms of the asks of them.
Yeah, I think, it's quite interesting. I wasn't around. The centre was started back in 2009 here in New Zealand. I wasn't working at the centre then, but I, often chat to the stories of our director and the people who work there. And they said back then, you couldn't get anyone to talk to you about climate change. It was just not on people's radar. And even I think, about two years ago, the government did a survey, I think, of over 700 farmers in New Zealand, asking them if anybody knew their greenhouse gas emissions profile, and only about 2% of people sort of answered, yeah, I could probably give you something. And that was probably from the dairy, and they were working with a tool called Overseer. So, and that wasn't surprising because, greenhouse gases were not on the in front of the farmer. And, they were pretty busy, dealing with, water regulations, which is very much, and water regulations is still very much up front and central for many New Zealand farmers. But I think, over the last 2 years, we've seen a shift in attitude, seeing a lot more people now. Obviously there's always the people who are really forward thinking. They're already getting on board because they're looking for the opportunities. You often see that with the younger farmers, actually, I think, who know that the farm is coming to them, or they're starting out, and so they're really keen. They know this is going to be a part of their business, and I think the government now, having given that clear signal about what's happening, we're now seeing a lot more people sort of start to ask questions and start to want to make themselves aware. Now, obviously, sort of from the science community, I often deal with, my selection of farmers are often quite a little bit biased, I think, because, they're often the people that are coming and talking to us. So, you'd probably need to speak to someone who's more boots on the ground, really, to give you that sort of overview of what's happening nationally. But, from my engagement, I think certainly the last 2 years, it's been a big shift. And, really, even in the last, 6 months, a big change. We're now getting asked, we started off doing working with the rural professionals, and now we're starting to get farmer groups coming, asking us, can you come out and, come for a farm day and just tell us a little bit, and just, so I think there's a sort of general acceptance that, there's no going back now, that it is just, unfortunately, another environmental variable that farmers will have to incorporate into their business. And you often hear a lot of people talking over here around having the license to farm, or the social license to farm is sort of the term I think people use. So there's no one excited about it, I would say, but I think sort of a general acceptance. And as I said, the sort of younger people who are sort of see themselves in the game for a lot longer, are really looking to see where the opportunities lie. Whereas, there's certainly a proportion of people who are like, well, if I get taxed, I'll just pay the tax and, you know, not worry about it as well. So a spectrum, I think, across the board. That would be my take on it. But as I said, I have a very biased group that I talk to who are very engaging. Yeah.
There's a number of questions again in the forestry area, and one particular issue I suppose relates to a kind of a debate here in Ireland between, I suppose, movement towards a commercial type forestry and a more natural afforestation. What's the mix, or what's the view there, or how is that being presented in policy terms in New Zealand?
Yeah. So we have a thing called plant a million trees, but policy, but and it's about finding the right place for the right tree, so that there's a huge policy on that. In terms of forestry, I'm not a huge expert on it, but I listen to quite a lot of experts talk about it, and the one thing that comes out all the time, it's so complicated, and you've got to be so careful about what you do, because there's so many things that go, because it's a long term and you're assuming a lot of things, particularly if you go down the route of carbon farming, or your decisions around whether you go for natives or whether you go for pine or populus, and so forth. So what was the question again?
No, it's just, I suppose, the balance between a native type forestry and a commercial forestry venture.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of money, I think, to be made in probably carbon farming. So that's why we're seeing a lot of our sheep and beef farmers, selling off their land into carbon farming. I don't have the numbers. I've heard them. But there's quite a lot going on. But the Climate Change Commission have really now, put forth that stuff. And I think I mentioned it in my talk about, encouragement of native forests. But the problem with native forests, apparently, is that it's incredibly expensive to get up and running in New Zealand. I think it's around somewhere between 10,000 to 40,000 a hectare or something, compared to, I think, 1,500 a hectare for a pine. And so it's but acknowledging that there is quite a lot of interest from people in native forests, and these are people who are particularly willing to take the upfront costs on setting up a native forest for the benefits of their grandchildren or their grandchildren's children. So it's a bit of a mix. It all depends, I guess, on what you're planning. But my sum up of forestry, it's complicated, and make sure you have an expert tell you what to do, or that's what they say here in New Zealand anyway. So I'm not sure if I answered that question very well, but a bit of information anyway.
I think it aligns with, I suppose, some of the thinking here. A couple of quick questions. There's a question there in relation to the genetics work in terms of methane reduction. Are you looking at the potential impact of if you get improvements in methane emissions? Is that impacting on the output factors of those animals?
Yeah, no. So yes, they have. So in relation to the sheep, so the sheep work which is the one that has progressed the most. Yes, they've looked across a wide range of productivity, and I think there's almost even, and I don't want to, I'd have to look at it again, but I think it's almost positive more towards the low emissions sheep, and I think they've got better marbling in their meat and better quality in their actual wool, just slightly. So there's actually, but the general consensus, there's no difference in terms of productivity between the high and the low methane phenotypes. Yeah.
Okay, and a good number of questions around the methane vaccines as to how that might work.
Yeah, so essentially, so the methane vaccine really, so the immune system, so there's no immune system in the forestomach, the rumen of the animal. So what the researchers are trying to do is they're going to try and stimulate the immune system in the saliva, in the mouth, and then the saliva then will essentially carry the antibodies into the rumen, because there's quite a lot of saliva that flows through the ruminant animal per day. I'm sure there's an animal person listening who'll know it off by heart how much saliva goes through a ruminant animal, but I think somewhere like 200 liters or something for a dairy cattle. It's a lot. And essentially, basically, it'll be stimulated in the saliva. It'll be washed into the rumen, and essentially that antibody will essentially go and find that will be directed specifically to those methane forming microbes, and essentially bind onto those methane forming microbes and actually prevent them from replicating or essentially living. So you basically impact them, they can't grow, and so you reduce their numbers. So that's in theory what is expected to happen. The number where it comes from, where I said they expect that they would see somewhere between a 20 and a 30% decrease in methane, really comes from the studies that have been done with that methane inhibitor. One of the best studies, methane inhibitors, is a 3-NOP. It's or Bovar is the name of the product that it'll eventually be marketed as. And essentially 3-NOP is an inhibitor. So you feed it in feed. It was designed for in-shed feeding, and it basically, just like an antibiotic, it goes into the rumen of the stomach and it attacks or it basically affects those methane forming microbes so that they can't produce methane anymore. And we know with those inhibitors that, there's been quite a lot of robust studies done with them, that they can get around, I think on average, around a 30% reduction in methane per animal. So the methane vaccine and the inhibitor, although they have different modes of action, they are essentially basically taking out or reducing the impact of those methane forming microbes to be able to produce methane. So that's how the vaccine essentially works in detail. Yeah.
Okay, Sinead, I think we're going to have to cut it there. Sinead has to go to bed at some stage, Pat.
Well, no, just a final comment that there's a few comments in there that if you ever get fed up of the good life in New Zealand, you have plenty of offers to come and milk from various people.
I'm not sure how that would affect their bottom line, though.
Yes, a lot of offers coming from Limerick and Carlow and Laois. So,
nice. Yeah,
Sinead,
great.
Yeah.
I've got a second career. Thanks, everyone. I'll be terrible, but I do my job. Yeah.
Okay, Sinead, look, thank you so much for putting so much effort into your presentation today. And for us now, it was excellent to get an insight of what's happening in New Zealand, given the similarities between the countries. And hopefully we maybe touch base again in the future, and just to
absolutely,
because I mean this is a very live situation, I suppose, in across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, by the end of this year or, early next year, again, we'll start to see more certainty as sort of Hawak Econoa moves through its processes. We'll definitely be getting, some more clarity. And, again, how does the New Zealand public, sort of respond to the Climate Change Commission's proposed path as well, which really sees, every sector of society in New Zealand hurt, in some bit. It is really asking us to change how we currently live. So, it is certainly an evolving situation, and who knows what we'll look like in 12 months time as is. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And just finally to thank our production team, Andy Boland, Catherine Keena, Pat Murphy, and Yvonne Maher. And if you'd like to receive updates on training opportunities, latest publications and invitations to events from Teagasc, you can sign up to the Teagasc Connected Digital Program for free. And we hope you can just keep in touch with us. So until next week, again, Sinead, thank you so much, and Pat for assisting with all of those questions. Lots and lots of questions, huge interest, Sinead, and you might even have broken a new record in terms of the numbers of viewers that we've had today. So we hope we hope to keep in touch with you anyway.
Well, isn't that what don't Limerick we win all the All-Irelands now, isn't it?
Oh, God. You were smug at the start and now you're bragging.
I'll go to bed, so.
Okay, Sinead, take care, and we'll talk to you again
everyone
soon.
Lovely to talk to everyone at home in Ireland.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.